We've gotten into sausage making lately, and I want to share some tips that I wish I knew before I started. Tip number 1, keep the meat as cold as possible. If you try to do this with meat that is the same temperature as the refrigerator, it's going to get really gummy really quickly. If you can freeze this to the point where it's doughy to the touch, where if you press into it, it's not completely solid, but it leaves an imprint, that's where you want to be. Tip 2, run about 30% belly fat when you're using pork, and use pork belly fat if you're working with venison or other wild game. If you use the fat from the wild game, it can come out extremely gamey, whereas if you use the fat from the pork, it comes out extremely delicious. I'll even go as far as to take these containers and put them back into the freezer in between rounds of grinding so that they can stay as cold as possible. Some people like to even freeze the implements that they're using on their grinders themselves. However, I don't go that far. I just freeze the meat and the grinder stays room temperature. Tip 3, cut the meat into strips that will barely fit down the throat of the grinder. Then you can feed them in one at a time and let the grinder take hold. Now, some of you might be cringing at watching the fingers go close to this hole, but this specific grinder was designed so that the throat is longer than a normal human's finger. So even if you tried to jam your hand down in there, you're never going to get down low enough to touch the screw. Here's a good shot of the difference in color between the fatty tissue on the left and the muscle tissue on the right. Now, if this was warm, all of this would be getting extremely goopy and liquidy and melting because it's fat and proteins. We're using an LEM number 8 big bite grinder today. It is a little bit pricey, but for the amount that we use it is extremely valuable to the homestead. It can grind up 8 pounds of meat per minute, so even for this 16-pound batch that we did today, literally only took the grinder 2 minutes to get through it the first pass. Now, as I prep for the second pass, I want to note that the second pass is a lot slower. It doesn't do 8 pounds per minute when you're running it through the more fine-sized grates, only when you're using that initial grinder that I'm pulling off right there. You can see the coarse grind on the left and the fine grinder on the right. Here you can see the big bite grinder. It takes a large bite and then compresses it towards the grinder and the blade in the front. Now, what's really important is that you orient this blade to be against that grinding grate, because if you flip it around backwards, it will assemble, but it will not process meat nearly as quickly as if it's assembled properly. We oriented this improperly the first time we used it, and it was not an impressive display of grinding capability. This little tab at the bottom allows the machine to hold that grate in place so it doesn't spin with the blade, otherwise it wouldn't work properly. Make sure you line that up or you will not be able to thread the cap on completely. I'd like to point out that I'm not affiliated with any of these brands. These are just the ones that I picked out, and I've been pretty happy with them overall. If I see an issue or if I have an issue with it, I would make that clear to the audience. Tip number 4 is don't add your spices and your seasonings until after your coarse grind, but before the fine grind. This allows you to create a more even distribution of those spices. Now, what I did here is I mixed up all the ingredients into one bowl, and I pre-mixed them so that they don't end up having pockets of pepper or paprika in random areas of the sausage. It allows for a more even distribution is what I mean. Mixing by hand is a necessity at this point because I don't have the seasoning mixer that is designed for this purposes, but it's kind of fun to get in there and move it all around. I don't use gloves when I'm prepping my food for home use. It's been suggested that using gloves can promote bacterial growth because you do not wash your hands as often, whereas I wash my hands every 5 or 10 minutes when doing this because I don't like the feeling of the grease on them anyways. The recipe calls for a quarter of this bottle of maple syrup, so of course I add half and then add the rest of it because I love maple syrup, and this stuff's going to be free for us in our homesteading adventure anyways. Our bit of acreage up in Michigan has quite a few sugar maples on them, so this will be something that we can produce for free, whereas right now we're spending an arm and a leg just to make our own sausages. And if you haven't guessed by now, these are breakfast sausages: maple syrup, paprika, salt, pepper, and a few other ingredients. I'm not listing my recipe out here because frankly I stole it from somewhere on the internet, and I expect to do the same for my next batch. I don't have a proprietary blend that I can share right now. Now that we're moving on to the fine grinding, I'm going to use this little plunger push tool and help get that meat down into the screw. It doesn't catch on it nearly as well as when it's large chunks of meat. This step thoroughly mixes those spices and that fat that we ground separately into the rest of the material so that it is extremely consistent throughout. Now, before I move on to stuffing, I always cook up a portion of what I've made so far. Most of the time it's delicious, but I have identified once where we cooked it up and it tasted horrible. We identified that we forgot to add the salt. So there's absolutely zero salt in the entire mixture, and we found that out before stuffing the sausages because we cook up this little test bite prior to the next step. This is our first time using this sausage press. It's a vertical plunger system where you crank a handle and it pushes down and it extrudes the meat into these different tubes. Each one has a different sausage casing size that is associated with it. You basically screw it on, fill it up like a big grease gun, and then you can consistently fill the sausage casings by cranking the lever at the top that's right out of frame. We tried doing this directly from the grinder as it's intended. However, the sausages came out very inconsistent. A lot of air bubbles got pushed through with them, and we didn't like the overall product. So we have a machine that helps us with eliminating those inconsistencies and those air bubbles. Now, when threading your casings, it's important to get some water inside the casing and then keep that nozzle down near the water so that it slides right onto the end and you don't have any trouble with it getting tangled. The closer you are to the bowl for the threading of the casings, the easier it is. Next, I'm going to tie a knot in the end of this so that we don't have any sausage squeezing through, and then go ahead and start from there. At first, I would crank a little and then wind up a few sausages and then crank a little bit more, trying to do a one-man operation. Turned out that this was extremely difficult and time-consuming, so we ended up getting someone else to crank the handle while I worked on the sausages. All you have to do for this part is twist one towards you, pinch out another section, and twist one away from you. And as you twist back and forth, it gives you those little tails on the end. It's a good place to cut them once they've dried out in the refrigerator for a couple of hours, or after you've frozen them, you can trim them apart. But I leave them linked pretty much until we're prepping the food. Tip number 5, no matter what you did with your day, make sure you take a step back and take a look at what you made or what you did so you get that sense of satisfaction at the end of the day. Take care.